The transmission arrived on a Tuesday morning at the Arecibo successor array, buried within the cosmic background radiation like a dying whisper. Dr. Quas, Elena Vasquez, had been monitoring deep space frequencies for 17 years, but she had never heard anything quite like this. The signal pulsed with mathematical precision, yet carried something that made her skin crawl with inexplicable dread. "Computer, isolate and enhance audio component," she commanded, her fingers dancing across holographic interfaces that materialized in the sterile white laboratory. The walls around her were lined with quantum processors, their blue glow casting eerie shadows as they worked to decode the mysterious transmission. What emerged from the speakers made Elena stumble backward, knocking over her coffee mug. The ceramic shattered against the floor, but she barely noticed. The sound was unmistakably organic, unmistakably alien, and unmistakably terrified. Beneath layers of digital encoding lay what could only be described as screaming. Within hours, the discovery had reached the highest levels of government. The United Nations Space Command convened an emergency session in Geneva, where representatives from every major nation gathered around a circular table that had once hosted discussions about Earthbound conflicts. Now, humanity faced something far more significant. Admiral Sarah Chen stood before the assembly, her uniform crisp despite having worked through the night. Behind her, a massive holographic display showed the decoded transmission in its full, horrifying clarity. The signal contained not just the screams, but also star charts, technological specifications, and what appeared to be a desperate plea for help written in mathematics that transcended language barriers. The transmission originates from the Kepler 442 system, approximately 1,200 light-years from Earth.
Admiral Chen began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was reporting.
Our xenolinguistics team has worked around the clock to decode the mathematical components. What we've found defies everything we thought we knew about our place in the universe. The hologram shifted, displaying a three-dimensional map of local galactic space. Red dots appeared like a spreading infection across dozens of star systems, each one representing a civilization that had fallen silent over the past millennium. Humanity had assumed the cosmos was empty, but they had been catastrophically wrong. "The message is from a species calling themselves the Vorthak Collective," Chen continued. "They're warning us about something they call the Devourers, entities that consume entire civilizations, leaving nothing but empty worlds and silence behind. According to their data, the Devourers have already consumed over 300 intelligent species in our galactic neighborhood." Dr. James Morrison, Earth's leading xenobiologist, raised his hand from the British delegation. His face was pale and his usually confident demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled fear. "Admiral, the biological data they've included suggests these Devourers aren't just aggressive aliens. There's something far worse. The readings indicate they're capable of consuming not just organic matter, but quantum information itself. They don't just kill civilizations, they erase them from reality." The chamber fell silent except for the hum of air recyclers. President Maria Santos of the Brazilian Federation was the first to speak, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "How long do we have?"
Chen's expression darkened.
"Based on the Vorthak's calculations and the trajectory data we've extrapolated, the Devourers will reach Earth in approximately 18 months. But that's not the worst part." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the assembly. "The Vorthak aren't just warning us, they're begging us for help." The German Chancellor, Klaus Weber, leaned forward in his chair. "Help? What could a species 1,200 light-years away possibly expect us to do? We've barely mastered interplanetary travel, let alone intergalactic warfare." "That's where it gets interesting," Chen replied, activating another section of the hologram. This time it displayed schematics that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "The Vorthak have been monitoring our electromagnetic emissions for decades. They know about our wars, our conflicts, our tendency toward violence. Most civilizations see this as a weakness, but the Vorthak believe it might be exactly what's needed to fight the Devourers." Yuki Tanaka from the Japanese delegation stood up, her face a mask of confusion and concern. "You're suggesting they want us to be violent? That they're asking us to become galactic mercenaries?" "Not mercenaries," Chen corrected. "Warriors. The Vorthak and every other civilization that's encountered the Devourers has tried to fight them with conventional weapons, energy-based attacks, even attempts at diplomatic contact. Nothing works. The Devourers consume everything they encounter, growing stronger with each civilization they devour." She gestured to the schematics floating in the air above them. "But humans fight differently. We don't just use tools, we become the tools. We don't just adapt to environments, we reshape them to suit our needs. The Vorthak believe that human psychological warfare, our capacity for creative destruction, might be the key to stopping the Devourers. The Russian representative, General Dmitry Volkov, slammed his fist on the table. This is madness. You're asking us to believe that our worst qualities, our capacity for violence and destruction, are somehow going to save the galaxy? Not just save it, Chen replied quietly. According to the Vorthak's historical records, every civilization that's encountered the Devourers has tried to preserve their moral high ground, their ethical standards, even in the face of total extinction. They've refused to become monsters, even to fight monsters. The Vorthak think that's why they all failed. Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had been quietly observing from the scientific advisory panel, finally spoke up. There's something else in the transmission that the Admiral hasn't mentioned yet. The Vorthak haven't just been monitoring our electromagnetic emissions. They've been studying our entertainment, our literature, our horror movies and war films. They're not just asking for our help. They're asking us to become exactly what we've always feared we might be. The chamber erupted in heated discussions as delegates tried to process the implications. Admiral Chen raised her hand for silence, and gradually, the voices died down. The decision before us isn't whether to help the Vorthak, she said solemnly. The decision is whether we're willing to embrace the darkness within ourselves, to save not just humanity, but every remaining intelligent species in the galaxy. The Vorthak have sent us the coordinates to their homeworld, along with faster-than-light travel specifications that could get us there in months rather than millennia. President Santos stood up, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had led her nation through multiple crises. What exactly are they asking us to do? Chen's smile was grim and filled with a terrible understanding. They want us to teach them how to be human, how to fight without honor, how to win at any cost, how to become the very monsters that our own species has spent centuries trying to overcome. They want us to show them how to fight terror with terror. The next few hours were filled with frantic discussions, emergency votes, and consultations with military leaders across the globe. By evening Geneva time, humanity had made its decision. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. Earth would answer the call. Within weeks, construction began on humanity's first interstellar fleet. The ships weren't elegant or beautiful like the vessels imagined in science fiction stories. They were brutal, functional machines designed for one purpose: to deliver humanity's unique brand of warfare to an enemy that had never faced anything like them. The recruitment process was unlike anything in military history. Rather than selecting the best and brightest, the selection committee sought out individuals with specific psychological profiles, creative problem solvers who could think outside conventional parameters, people who had overcome trauma and emerged stronger, individuals who could embrace necessary evils without losing their essential humanity. Captain Marcus Stone was among the first selected. A former Special Forces operative who had seen action in 3 different conflicts, he possessed the rare combination of tactical brilliance and psychological resilience that the mission would require. His file contained dozens of commendations for actions that officially never happened, operations that existed only in classified archives. During his final briefing, Stone sat across from Admiral Chen in her private office overlooking Lake Geneva. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and red, colors that seemed appropriate for what they were about to undertake. "You understand what you're volunteering for, Captain," Chen said, her voice heavy with the weight of command. "This isn't a rescue mission in any conventional sense. We're not going out there to save the galaxy through noble sacrifice or heroic gestures. We're going out there to become something that will make the Devourers afraid." Stone nodded, his expression calm despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. "With respect, Admiral, I think you're wrong about one thing. This is a rescue mission. We're just using unconventional methods. And if those methods require us to become the very thing we've always fought against, then that's a burden we'll have to carry," Stone replied without hesitation. "But if the alternative is universal extinction, then becoming monsters might be the most human thing we can do." As the weeks turned to months, humanity's fleet took shape. The ships bore names that reflected their grim purpose: Terror's Edge, Nightmare's Dawn, Humanity's Shadow. Each vessel was equipped not just with advanced weapons systems provided by Vorthak technology, but with something far more dangerous: human creativity unleashed from the constraints of civilized warfare. The psychologists and sociologists assigned to the project worked around the clock to develop new forms of psychological warfare, drawing inspiration from humanity's darkest chapters while refining them into weapons that could break alien minds. The engineers created devices that didn't just destroy, but inspired primal fear in ways that conventional weapons never could. Dr. Sarah Kim, the project's lead xenopsychologist, presented her preliminary findings to the command staff just days before the fleet's departure. Her report would have been classified as crimes against sentience by any civilized standard. But these were no longer civilized times. We've identified 17 different categories of universal fears that appear to transcend species barriers, she explained, her voice clinical despite the horrifying nature of her work. Based on the Vorthak psychological profiles of the Devourers, we've developed targeted terror protocols that should prove effective regardless of their actual biology. The fleet departed on a cold morning in November, exactly 11 months after the first transmission had been received. As the ships engaged their faster-than-light drives and disappeared into the void between stars, humanity held its collective breath. They had answered the galaxy's call for help, but in doing so, they had chosen to become something that might be worse than the enemy they were going to fight. The stars had cried out for help, and humanity had answered with the promise of terrors beyond imagination. As Earth grew smaller in the rear displays of the departing ships, Captain Stone stood on the bridge of Terror's edge and wondered if they would still be human when they returned, if they returned at all. The galaxy was about to learn why humanity had always been afraid of the dark corners of their own souls. Soon, the Devourers would learn to fear those same shadows. The first phase of humanity's response to the galactic crisis had begun, and there would be no turning back from the path they had chosen. The universe was about to discover what happened when Earth's children decided to stop pretending to be civilized. The Vorthak homeworld appeared on the main display like a dying ember against the cosmic void. What had once been a thriving planet of azure oceans and emerald continents now showed the scars of a desperate civilization preparing for extinction. Massive orbital defense platforms surrounded the world like a crown of thorns, their weapons trained not outward toward approaching threats, but inward toward the planet's surface. Captain Marcus Stone studied the tactical readouts from the bridge of Terra's edge. 3 months of faster-than-light travel had brought humanity's fleet to the edge of Vorthak space, but nothing could have prepared them for what they found waiting. The planet below wasn't just fortified, it was prepared for self-destruction on a scale that defied comprehension. "Sir, we're receiving multiple communication attempts," reported Lieutenant Commander Sarah Walsh, her fingers dancing across the communications console. "The Vorthak are broadcasting on 17 different frequencies simultaneously. They seem desperate." Stone nodded grimly. "Put them through all frequencies." The bridge speakers crackled to life, and the sound that emerged was unlike anything the human crew had ever heard. The Vorthak voices were harmonic, almost musical, but underneath the alien beauty lay an unmistakable note of terror that transcended species barriers. Even without translation, the fear was palpable. Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had joined the expedition as the fleet's chief xenolinguist, worked frantically at her station to process the incoming messages. Her translation algorithms, enhanced with Vorthak linguistic data from the original transmission, began parsing the alien words into comprehensible English. "Captain," she called out, her voice tight with emotion, "they're not just greeting us. They're thanking us for coming, but they're also warning us away. They say the Devourers are less than 6 months out, and they don't want us to share their fate." Stone's expression hardened. "Open a channel, all frequencies." Quote, the bridge fell silent as Stone stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had led soldiers through the darkest moments of human conflict.
"This is Captain Marcus Stone of the Terran Expeditionary Fleet.
"We received your message, and we've come to help, but we're going to need you to trust us, even when what we ask you to do goes against everything you believe." The response came within minutes.
And when Dr.
Vasquez finished translating it, the entire bridge crew felt a chill run down their collective spine. The Vorthak weren't just grateful. They were ready to subordinate their entire civilization to human command if it meant survival. Within hours, the human fleet had taken up position in the Vorthak system's outer reaches. The aliens had provided detailed intelligence about the approaching Devourers, and the picture that emerged was more terrifying than anyone had imagined. The enemy wasn't a single species or even a collection of allied races. There was something far more insidious. Admiral Chen's voice crackled through the fleet's communication network from her flagship, Humanity's Shadow. "All ships, prepare for full intelligence briefing. What we're about to learn will change how we understand the nature of existence itself." The briefing room aboard Terra's Edge filled with the senior staff as holographic displays materialized around them. The Vorthak had provided petabytes of data about the Devourers, collected over centuries of desperate observation and failed resistance. Dr. Koo, James Morrison, the fleet's xenobiologist, stood before the assembled officers, his face pale with the implications of what he was about to share. The Devourers aren't a traditional alien species, he began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of his words. They're quantum parasites, entities that exist partially outside our normal space-time continuum. The holographic display showed what appeared to be a writhing mass of darkness punctuated by geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The shapes seemed to shift and change even as the officers watched, defying conventional physics in ways that made their minds rebel against accepting what they were seeing. They don't just consume matter and energy, Morrison continued. They consume information itself. When they devour a civilization, they don't just kill the inhabitants. They erase them from reality. Every achievement, every work of art, every thought that species ever had simply ceases to exist. Captain Stone leaned forward in his chair, his tactical mind already working on the implications. How do you fight something that can erase you from existence? That's the problem, Morrison replied. Every civilization that's tried has approached the problem logically, scientifically. They've attempted to understand the Devourers, to find rational solutions to an irrational threat. The Vorthak believe this is why they've all failed. Sarah Kim, the fleet xenopsychologist, stood up from her position at the back of the room. I've been analyzing the Vorthak's psychological profiles of the Devourers, and there's something interesting. The entities seem to feed not just on information but on order itself. Every civilization they've encountered has tried to maintain their social structures, their moral frameworks, their civilized approaches to warfare. She activated her own holographic display showing comparative analyses of the 17 civilizations that had left records of their encounters with the Devourers. In every case, the defending species tried to preserve their cultural identity while fighting. They maintained chain of command, followed rules of engagement, attempted to minimize collateral damage. They fought like civilized beings. Stone began to understand where this was leading. And civilized beings think in predictable patterns. Exactly, Kim confirmed. The Devourers appear to be capable of processing and countering logical, rational responses, but they've never encountered a species that deliberately embraces chaos, that uses unpredictability as a weapon. Over the following days, the human fleet began implementing protocols that would have been considered war crimes by any civilized standard. Working closely with Vorthak scientists and military leaders, they developed new categories of weapons that didn't just destroy, but traumatized reality itself. The collaboration between humans and Vorthak was unlike any interspecies cooperation in recorded galactic history. The aliens had spent millennia developing technologies that enhanced life and promoted harmony. Now they watched in fascination and horror as humans systematically corrupted those same technologies into instruments of psychological warfare. Commander Lisa Jane, the fleet's chief weapons designer, worked alongside Vorthak technician Zelnoth in a laboratory that looked more like a medieval torture chamber than a scientific facility. Together, they had created devices that could induce specific phobias in quantum-based entities, weapons that attacked the very concept of existence rather than mere physical forms. The terror field generators are ready for initial testing, Zhang reported during the daily briefing. We've combined human psychological warfare techniques with Vorthak quantum manipulation technology to create weapons that attack fear responses directly. Zelnoth, whose translated voice carried an undertone of awed horror, added, "The human concept of nightmare does not exist in our language. We have had to create new words to describe what you have taught us to build." The testing of humanity's new weapons began on the system's outermost planet, a dead world that the Vorthak had designated for experimental purposes. What happened there violated so many principles of civilized warfare that the recordings were classified at levels that didn't officially exist. The planet's surface was transformed into a testing ground for devices that could induce terror in entities that existed partially outside normal space-time. The humans had weaponized concepts that most species considered abstract: fear, despair, the primal terror of non-existence. Captain Stone stood in the observation deck aboard Terra's Edge, watching as the test weapons were deployed against quantum shadows created to simulate Devourer responses. What he saw challenged his understanding of what it meant to be human. The weapons didn't just destroy the test targets, they made them experience destruction in ways that transcended physical reality. The quantum shadows writhed and twisted, their mathematical essence contorting into patterns that suggested unimaginable suffering. "My God," whispered Lieutenant Walsh, who had been monitoring the weapon's effects. "We've turned pain itself into a weapon." Vasquez, observing from her linguistic station, was equally disturbed. The Vorthak are recording everything, cataloging each new form of warfare we develop. They're creating an archive of human military innovation that reads like a catalogue of cosmic horrors. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the weapons themselves, but how quickly the human crews adapted to using them. Within weeks, soldiers who had once considered themselves moral individuals were operating devices that weaponized existential dread without hesitation. The transformation wasn't limited to the military personnel. The scientists and engineers working on the project found themselves developing technologies that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Dr. Cole. Kim's psychological warfare division had created fear-based weapons so sophisticated that they could induce specific phobias in creatures they had never encountered. "We're becoming something new," she reported to Admiral Chen during a classified briefing. "The crew's psychological evaluations show consistent changes across all personnel. We're not just using these weapons, we're being changed by them." "Are we talking about psychological damage, combat stress?" "No, Admiral. We're talking about evolution. The human psyche is adapting to warfare on a cosmic scale. We're developing mental capabilities that we've never had before, ways of thinking that allow us to function in environments that would drive most sentient species insane." As the weeks passed and the Devourers drew closer, the collaboration between humans and Vorthak deepened into something that neither species had expected. The aliens weren't just learning human military tactics, they were learning to think like humans, to embrace the chaotic creativity that had always defined Earth's approach to problem-solving. The Vorthak military, once organized around principles of harmony and collective decision-making, began adopting human command structures based on individual authority and rapid response. Their scientists, who had spent centuries pursuing knowledge for its own sake, now focused entirely on developing more effective ways to inflict terror on their enemies. Zelnoth, who had become Captain Stone's primary alien liaison, underwent the most dramatic transformation of all. The Vorthak technician had begun the collaboration as a peaceful scientist dedicated to preserving life. Now, working alongside Commander Zhang, he had become something unprecedented in Vorthak history. A weapons designer who took pride in creating instruments of suffering. "Your species has taught us something profound," Zelnoth told Stone during one of their regular strategy sessions. "We always believed that civilization meant moving beyond violence, beyond the primitive instincts that drove our evolution. But you have shown us that sometimes survival requires embracing those instincts, not transcending them." Stone nodded, though he wondered what they were all becoming in the process. "The question is whether we'll still be recognizable as the species we started as when this is over. Does it matter?" Zelnoth asked, the translated question carrying an undertone of genuine curiosity. "If the alternative is extinction, is preservation of identity more important than preservation of existence?" It was a question that haunted Stone as the fleet made final preparations for the Devourer's arrival. Intelligence reports indicated that the enemy would reach the system within days, and the combined human Vorthak forces were as ready as they could make themselves. The orbital defense platforms had been retrofitted with human psychological warfare systems. The planet's surface bristled with weapons that could attack the concept of reality itself, and in the depths of space, humanity's fleet waited with weapons that turned terror into a tactical advantage. But the most significant change wasn't in the technology they had developed or the weapons they had built. It was in the people themselves. Humans and Vorthak alike had been transformed by their collaboration, becoming something new that neither species had been before. As the final hours before contact ticked away, Stone found himself wondering if they were about to save the galaxy or doom it to something worse than extinction. The weapons they had created were so far beyond conventional warfare that they challenged the very concepts of morality and civilization. The stars had cried out for help, and humanity had answered by becoming the very darkness that other species feared to acknowledge. Soon, they would discover whether the cure they had created was worse than the disease they were fighting. The second phase of humanity's response was complete, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Devourers arrived like a wound in reality itself. Captain Marcus Stone stood on the bridge of Terra's Edge, watching as space-time twisted and buckled at the edge of the Vorthak system. Instead, they seemed to unfold from dimensions that shouldn't have existed, their presence causing fundamental laws of physics to rewrite themselves in real time. "Sir, sensors are picking up massive gravitational distortions," reported Lieutenant Commander Walsh, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. "Whatever's coming through isn't following normal physics. It's like they're bringing their own reality with them." Dr. Elena Vasquez worked frantically at her station, trying to process the incoming data streams from the fleet's advanced sensors. The readings were beyond anything in human or Vorthak experience, defying classification in ways that made her scientific training feel utterly inadequate. "Captain," she called out, her voice cracking with strain. "The quantum resonance patterns suggest we're not just facing a fleet of ships. We're facing something that exists partially outside our universe. They're literally rewriting local space-time to accommodate their presence." The main display showed what human eyes could barely process, geometric shapes that changed configuration faster than conscious thought could follow, surrounded by darkness that seemed to actively consume light itself. The Devourers weren't ships in any recognizable sense. They were manifestations of entropy given form and purpose. Admiral Chen's voice crackled through the fleet communication system from humanity's shadow. All ships, this is Admiral Chen. Execute Terra Protocol Alpha. All crew members are authorized to use any means necessary to complete our mission. Standard military conduct is suspended as of this moment. Stone felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the full implications of those words. They had trained for this moment, prepared for the psychological warfare that would be necessary, but actually implementing Terra Protocol Alpha meant abandoning the last vestiges of civilized warfare. All stations, prepare for psychological warfare deployment, Stone commanded, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deeper and darker than his conscious mind. We're about to become something that will make the darkness afraid of us. The transformation that followed was as disturbing as it was necessary. Throughout the human fleet, crew members activated systems that had been designed to function as extensions of the human capacity for creative violence. The ships themselves became more than mere vessels. They became physical manifestations of humanity's willingness to embrace horror in service of survival. Aboard Terra's Edge, Doctor. Sarah Kim stood in what had once been a standard military briefing room, but now resembled something from humanity's darkest psychological experiments. Banks of quantum processors hummed with malevolent purpose as they generated fear-based weapon systems that attacked the concept of existence itself. All psychological warfare systems are online, she reported, her voice carrying an undertone of fascination that would have disturbed her colleagues weeks earlier. We're ready to deploy targeted terror protocols against quantum-based entities. The first engagement began not with weapons fire, but with humanity's opening gambit in psychological warfare on a cosmic scale. The human ships broadcast on frequencies that shouldn't have been possible, transmitting fears so primal that they transcended species barriers and struck at the fundamental concepts that allowed consciousness to exist. The effect on the Devourers was immediate and unprecedented. The geometric entities that had been approaching with inexorable purpose suddenly began to exhibit behavior patterns that suggested confusion, even distress. Their perfect formations wavered, their reality-warping effects fluctuated, and for the first time in galactic history, the Devourers hesitated. Captain Stone watched the tactical display with grim satisfaction as the enemy's advance faltered. It's working. They've never encountered anything like human psychological warfare. They don't know how to process fear-based attacks. But the Devourers' confusion was temporary. Within minutes, the entities began to adapt, their quantum structures reconfiguring to defend against the human terror weapons. What emerged from this adaptation was something that challenged the sanity of everyone who observed it. The Devourers began to emit their own psychological weapons, but theirs were based not on fear, but on something far worse: the absolute certainty of meaninglessness. They projected existential despair so profound that several crew members across the human fleet had to be physically restrained to prevent them from attempting suicide. They're learning from us, Dr. Kim reported, her voice barely controlled, as she fought against the waves of cosmic despair washing over her psyche. They're taking human psychological warfare concepts and corrupting them into weapons of pure nihilism. It was then that humanity revealed the true depths of their strategic thinking. The terror weapons had been merely the opening move, designed not to defeat the Devourers, but to force them to reveal their adaptive capabilities. What followed was the implementation of warfare concepts so fundamentally human that no other species could have conceived them. Commander Lisa Jane activated the second wave of weapons from her position aboard humanity's shadow. These weren't devices designed to inspire fear or despair. They were weapons that attacked the very concept of order and predictability that the Devourers used to maintain their existence. Chaos fields are active, she reported. We're introducing random variables into local space-time that should interfere with their quantum coherence. The weapons Zhang had developed didn't just create random energy patterns. They weaponized the human capacity for illogical thinking, for making decisions that defied rational analysis. The chaos fields generated by the human fleet were unlike anything the Devourers had ever encountered because they were based on a fundamental aspect of human psychology: the ability to act irrationally and still achieve desired outcomes. The effect on the Devourers was catastrophic. Entities that had existed for millions of years by consuming ordered information structures suddenly found themselves unable to process the chaotic inputs being generated by human weapons. Their quantum matrices began to destabilize, their reality-warping abilities failed, and several of the smaller entities simply ceased to exist. But the true horror of humanity's response became apparent when the Vorthak forces joined the battle. The aliens, taught by humans to embrace their own capacity for violence, deployed weapons that combined Vorthak quantum manipulation technology with human psychological warfare concepts. Zelnoth, the Vorthak technician who had worked most closely with the humans, commanded a modified orbital defense platform that had been transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to his species months earlier. The weapon he activated didn't just attack the Devourers. It forced them to experience every fear that every sentient species had ever felt. Human tactical concepts are being implemented, Zelnoth reported, his translated voice carrying an undertone of savage satisfaction that would have been impossible for a Vorthak before contact with humanity. The enemy is experiencing what you call terror for the first time in their existence. The battle that followed redefined warfare on a galactic scale. The Devourers, accustomed to facing civilized species that fought according to predictable patterns, found themselves confronting opponents who embraced chaos as a tactical advantage. Human commanders made decisions that defied military logic, but achieved strategic objectives that conventional thinking could never have reached. Captain Stone coordinated the fleet's movements from Terra's edge, but his tactical approach bore no resemblance to standard military doctrine. Instead of attempting to maintain formation or preserve resources, he scattered his ships across the system in patterns that seemed random but were actually based on psychological models of unpredictability. All ships execute Nightmare Protocol, he commanded. Forget everything you learned in military academy. Fight like humans, not like soldiers. What followed was warfare that challenged the very concepts of strategy and tactics. Human ships appeared and disappeared from seemingly impossible locations, their weapons creating effects that violated established physics. The crews fought not just with technology, but with the accumulated psychological weapons of a species that had spent millennia learning to make war against itself. Dr. Vasquez, monitoring communications from her station, realized that the battle was changing the participants in ways that went beyond mere combat experience. "Captain," she called out, "I'm detecting fundamental alterations in human brain chemistry across the fleet. We're not just fighting the Devourers, we're evolving into something designed specifically to fight them." The transformation was most apparent in the hand-to-hand combat that occurred when several Devourer entities managed to board human ships. The creatures expected to face opponents limited by physical laws and rational thinking. Instead, they encountered humans who had weaponized insanity itself. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, leading a boarding defense team aboard humanity's Shadow, fought the intruding Devourers with techniques that combined military training with psychological warfare concepts. Her team didn't just try to kill the entities, they tried to make them experience fear so intense that their quantum coherence collapsed. "They're trying to consume our thoughts," she reported via comlink, her voice steady despite the impossibility of what she was describing. "But human thoughts don't follow the patterns they expect. They can't process the chaos in our minds." The turning point came when Admiral Chen made a decision that violated every principle of military command. Instead of coordinating a conventional defense, she ordered the entire human fleet to implement Protocol Omega, the complete abandonment of rational tactical thinking in favor of warfare based entirely on human psychological advantages.
All ships, all personnel, her voice broadcast across the fleet.
"Stop trying to fight like a civilized species. Remember what we are. Remember why every other species in the galaxy has always been a little afraid of us. Show the Devourers what happens when Earth's children stop pretending to be civilized." What followed could barely be described as a battle. It was more like a demonstration of what happened when a species that had evolved to survive on a death world decided to stop holding back. The human crews fought with a creativity and viciousness that transcended conventional warfare, turning every system on their ships into weapons, using their own psychological instabilities as tactical advantages. The Devourers, despite their eons of experience consuming civilizations, had never encountered anything like human warfare. They had faced species that fought with energy weapons, with advanced technology, with superior numbers. But they had never faced opponents who weaponized their own madness, who turned psychological damage into a strategic advantage. As the battle raged across the Vortex system, it became clear that something unprecedented was happening. The Devourers weren't just being defeated, they were being traumatized. For the first time in their existence, they were experiencing something that their quantum matrices couldn't process or consume: genuine terror. The human weapons didn't just damage the Devourer entities, they infected them with concepts that their reality-based existence couldn't handle. Fear, chaos, irrational thinking, and creative violence spread through the Devourer force like a virus, causing their quantum coherence to destabilize in ways that no previous civilization had achieved. But the most disturbing aspect of the victory wasn't the defeat of the Devourers, it was what the humans and their Vorthak allies were becoming in the process. The crews that had begun the mission as representatives of civilized species were transforming into something new, something designed specifically for warfare against entities that existed beyond conventional reality. As the last of the Devourer entities fled the system, their quantum signatures badly damaged by exposure to weaponized human psychology, Captain Stone stood on the bridge of Terra's Edge and realized that they had won something more significant than a single battle. They had won by becoming the very thing that had always lurked in the dark corners of the human psyche. They had embraced the monster within and used it to fight monsters from beyond reality itself. The third phase of humanity's response to the galactic crisis had succeeded, but the cost was becoming clear. The galaxy now had a defense against the Devourers, but that defense required becoming something that might be worse than the original threat. The stars had cried out for help, and humanity had answered by transforming themselves into the nightmares that even nightmares feared. The aftermath of victory brought silence more terrifying than the battle itself. Captain Marcus Stone walked through the corridors of Terra's Edge 3 days after the Devourers' retreat, and what he saw challenged his understanding of what his crew had become. The ship's interior had been modified during the battle, but not by conscious design. The human crew had unconsciously reshaped their environment to better accommodate their transformed psychological state. The walls now bore patterns that seemed to shift when observed directly. Geometric designs that resembled the Devourer entities but somehow felt fundamentally human. The lighting had been altered to create shadows that moved independently of their sources, and the air recycling system had been modified to carry scents that triggered primal memories of ancient fears. Status report, Dr. Kim, Stone requested as he entered what had once been the ship's standard medical bay. The room had been transformed into something that resembled a combination of a psychiatric facility and a weapons laboratory, filled with equipment that monitored and enhanced the crew's psychological capabilities. Dr. Sarah Kim looked up from her work, and Stone had to suppress a shiver at what he saw in her eyes. The compassionate military psychologist who had joined the mission months earlier had been replaced by someone who understood fear and madness with an intimacy that bordered on disturbing. The crew adaptation continues to exceed all projected parameters, she reported, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed designed to induce specific emotional responses. We're not just maintaining the psychological modifications required for fighting the Devourers, we're continuing to evolve beyond baseline human psychology. She gestured to a series of holographic displays showing brain scan comparisons from before and after the battle. Neural pathway development in areas associated with creative violence has increased by 300% across all personnel. More significantly, we're developing entirely new neural structures that appear to be specifically adapted for quantum-level psychological warfare.
Stone studied the displays with growing concern. Are we talking about permanent changes?
Captain, at this point, I'm not sure the concept of permanent applies to what we're becoming, Kim replied.
The human brain is actively rewriting itself to optimize for warfare against entities that exist partially outside normal reality. We're becoming something new. Kim's report became clear as Stone continued his inspection of the ship. In the engineering sections, Commander Walsh had led her teams in developing weapon modifications that defied conventional physics. The devices they had created during the heat of battle weren't just functional. They were works of art that expressed violence as an aesthetic concept. Sir, Walsh reported when Stone reached the main engineering deck, the crew has been requesting permission to implement additional modifications to our terror weapons systems. They're developing new concepts for psychological warfare that go beyond anything we originally planned. Stone examined the weapon schematics that Walsh's team had developed, and what he saw made him question whether they were still fighting for the right reasons. The devices were elegant in their horror, designed not just to defeat enemies, but to create suffering so refined that it approached artistry. These weapons don't just attack enemy psychological structures, he observed. They're designed to make suffering beautiful. Walsh's expression showed a pride that would have been disturbing in any other context. Yes, sir. We've learned to make terror itself into something aesthetically appealing. The crew believes this will make our weapons more effective against entities that process reality through pattern recognition. The transformation wasn't limited to the human crews. Throughout the Vorthak system, the aliens who had fought alongside humanity were undergoing changes that challenged the very foundations of their civilization. The species that had spent millennia developing technologies to enhance life and promote harmony was now creating weapons that redefined the nature of violence itself. Zalnoth, the Vorthak technician who had worked most closely with human weapons designers, had become something unprecedented in his species' history. When Stone met with him in the orbital station's command center, the alien's appearance had been altered by his exposure to human psychological warfare concepts. "Captain Stone," Zalnoth said, his translated voice carrying undertones that suggested fundamental changes in Vorthak vocal patterns. "My people have asked me to express their gratitude for what you have taught us. We had thought that survival required preserving our civilized nature, but you have shown us that sometimes civilization itself must be transformed to survive."
The changes in Zalnoth went beyond mere behavioral adaptation.
The Vorthak's crystalline skin structure had been altered by prolonged exposure to human terror weapons, taking on patterns that resembled human neural networks. His thought processes had been fundamentally changed by his collaboration with humanity, making him capable of conceptualizing forms of violence that no Vorthak had ever imagined. "What concerns me," Stone said carefully, "is that we may have won this battle by becoming something that's ultimately more dangerous than the enemy we defeated." Zalnoth's response carried an undertone of what could only be described as savage wisdom. "Captain, the Devourers consumed entire civilizations by erasing their capacity for creative thought. You have taught us that the answer to such a threat is not to preserve our existing forms of creativity, but to develop new forms that the enemy cannot process or consume." Over the following days, reports arrived from across the galaxy that confirmed Stone's growing fears about what they had unleashed. The few surviving Devourers that had escaped the battle were spreading something throughout space that intelligence reports classified as terror contamination. Entire star systems were being affected by exposure to the psychological weapons that humanity had deployed. Dr. Elena Vasquez, monitoring galactic communication networks from her enhanced linguistic station, brought Stone reports that challenged his understanding of what they had accomplished. "Captain, we're receiving transmissions from 17 different star systems that report fundamental changes in local space-time properties. The weapons we used against the Devourers have created lasting effects that are spreading through subspace." The reports described phenomena that defied classification. Planets where the laws of physics had been altered to accommodate fear-based reality structures. Star systems where time moved at rates determined by local terror levels, and regions of space where consciousness itself had been weaponized into a survival mechanism. "It appears," Vasquez continued, "that our psychological warfare weapons have created permanent changes in the quantum structure of local galactic space. We haven't just defeated the Devourers, we've transformed the galaxy into something that can actively resist their presence." But the most disturbing reports came from civilizations that had observed the battle from a distance. Species across the galaxy were reporting the same phenomenon. Exposure to human psychological warfare concepts was triggering evolutionary responses in their own populations. The Zephyrian Collective, a peaceful species known for their philosophical contributions to galactic culture, had sent a message that Dr. Vasquez translated with growing unease. "The humans have shown us capabilities we did not know existed within sentient consciousness. We are experiencing changes in our thought patterns that suggest we are adapting to survive in a galaxy where such warfare is possible." Similar reports arrived from dozens of other species. The mere knowledge that humanity's approach to psychological warfare existed was causing civilizations throughout the galaxy to develop their own versions of terror-based defense mechanisms. Admiral Chen convened an emergency meeting of senior staff aboard humanity's Shadow to address the implications of what they had accomplished. The briefing room had been modified during the battle, taking on characteristics that reflected the crew's transformed psychological state. The furniture had been reshaped into forms that induced specific emotional responses, and the lighting created patterns that enhanced tactical thinking while suppressing moral considerations. "We need to address the elephant in the room," Chen began, her voice carrying authority that seemed to come from depths of command experience that hadn't existed before the battle. "Our victory against the Devourers has created consequences that extend far beyond this star system." Dr. Morrison, the fleet's xenobiologist, presented his analysis of the galactic-scale changes they had triggered. "The psychological warfare weapons we deployed have created what can only be described as a contagious transformation in galactic consciousness. Species across known space are developing their own versions of terror-based survival mechanisms." He activated holographic displays showing the spread of what intelligence analysts had termed the terror evolution across galactic space. "We've essentially triggered an evolutionary arms race, with hundreds of species developing psychological warfare capabilities in response to the knowledge that such weapons are possible." Captain Stone studied the displays with growing concern. "Are we talking about defensive adaptations or the development of offensive capabilities?" "Both," Morrison replied grimly. "Some species are developing defenses against psychological warfare, while others are creating their own terror-based weapons. The galaxy is rapidly dividing into factions based on their approach to this new form of warfare. The implications became clear as additional reports arrived over the following hours. The crystalline hegemony had developed weapons that attacked the concept of individual identity, turning entire populations into components of a collective consciousness designed to resist psychological warfare. The Flame Worlds had created devices that weaponized religious ecstasy, inducing states of fanatical devotion that made their populations immune to fear-based attacks. Most disturbing of all, several species had attempted to recreate human psychological warfare techniques and had accidentally triggered the development of entities similar to the Devourers. 3 star systems had gone silent after their experiments with terror-based weapons had created quantum parasites that consumed their creators. "We've opened a box that can't be closed," Admiral Chen observed during the final briefing. The knowledge that psychological warfare on a cosmic scale is possible has fundamentally changed the nature of galactic civilization. Dr. Kim presented her psychological analysis of the human crews, and her findings were as disturbing as they were inevitable. The modifications we've undergone aren't just adaptations to fighting the Devourers. We've developed psychological capabilities that make us optimized for warfare against any form of sentient opposition. She showed brain scans that revealed the extent of the changes in human neural structure. We're no longer baseline humans. We've become something designed specifically for cosmic scale conflict. The question is whether we can coexist with other species, or if we've become something that other civilizations will need to defend against. The answer to that question came sooner than anyone expected, but joint communication from the Galactic Council, representing over 200 species, arrived with a message that changed everything. Humanity was being invited to become the galaxy's official guardians against existential threats, but with conditions that challenged the very concepts of freedom and self-determination. The Council recognizes the effectiveness of human psychological warfare capabilities. Dr. Vasquez translated from the official communication. However, they're requesting that humanity submit to monitoring and control protocols designed to ensure that our abilities are only used against threats like the Devourers. The proposal was simultaneously an honor and an imprisonment. Humanity would be recognized as the galaxy's ultimate defense against cosmic-level threats, but in exchange they would be required to accept limitations on their own development and expansion. Captain Stone stood in his transformed ready room aboard Terra's Edge, studying the Council's proposal while considering the implications of what humanity had become. They had answered the galaxy's call for help and had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, but their success had transformed them into something that other species feared almost as much as they feared the Devourers. The stars had cried out for help, and humanity had answered by becoming the guardians of a galaxy that would never again sleep peacefully. They had saved civilization by embracing the darkness within themselves, but now they faced the question of whether the cure they had become was compatible with the peace they had fought to preserve. The 4th phase of humanity's transformation was complete, and the galaxy would never be the same. The question now was whether the new order they had created would be better than the extinction they had prevented. 5 years after the Battle of the Vorthak system, Captain Marcus Stone stood in the observation deck of the newly constructed Terran Guardian Station, watching as the latest group of alien delegates approached through space that still bore the scars of humanity's psychological warfare weapons. The region around the station existed in a state of quantum flux that made conventional physics suggestions rather than laws, a permanent reminder of what humans had become willing to do when existence itself was threatened. The station itself was a monument to the new galactic order that had emerged from humanity's victory over the Devourers. Built using technologies that combined human psychological warfare innovations with contributions from dozens of species, it served as both a fortress against cosmic threats and a prison for the Guardians who defended the galaxy from within it. Stone had aged in ways that transcended mere physical time. The psychological modifications that had allowed humans to fight entities from beyond reality had continued to evolve, transforming him and his crews into something that barely resembled the species that had first received the Vorthak distress call. His eyes now held depths that seemed to contain the accumulated fears of every species in the galaxy, and his voice carried harmonics that could induce specific emotional responses in any sentient being. "Admiral Chen is requesting your presence in the Council chamber," reported Commander Walsh, her own transformation having progressed to the point where she communicated as much through quantum resonance patterns as through traditional speech. The communications officer who had once struggled to maintain her composure during first contact with alien species now served as humanity's primary liaison with civilizations that existed partially outside normal space-time. Stone nodded, his movement triggering subtle changes in the station's environmental systems that had been designed to accommodate the crew's enhanced psychological capabilities. The corridor leading to the council chamber was lined with what appeared to be decorative patterns, but were actually sophisticated psychological warfare systems that could incapacitate hostile entities before they reached critical areas of the station. The council chamber itself was a marvel of interspecies cooperation and mutual fear. Representatives from 237 different civilizations maintained permanent embassies within the station, but the chamber's design ensured that no single species could feel entirely comfortable in the environment. The humans had learned to use psychological discomfort as a diplomatic tool, keeping their galactic partners slightly off balance while maintaining their own tactical advantages. Admiral Chen stood at the center of the chamber, her presence commanding attention from beings whose evolutionary paths had diverged millions of years before Earth had developed complex life. She had been transformed by her experiences even more dramatically than stone, becoming something that existed simultaneously as a human military commander and as a living embodiment of humanity's approach to cosmic warfare. "The Devourer remnant has been detected in the Andromeda Spiral," she announced without preamble, her voice carrying across the chamber through means that transcended conventional acoustics. "Long-range quantum sensors indicate that the entities we defeated have regrouped and are approaching through dimensions that we hadn't previously identified." The Vorthak representative, Selnoth, who had become the first alien to successfully integrate human psychological warfare concepts into his own mental structure, transmitted a response through quantum resonance patterns that Stone's enhanced consciousness interpreted as savage anticipation. The crystalline hegemony's delegate, a being whose thought processes had been fundamentally altered by exposure to human terror concepts, projected geometric patterns that expressed both gratitude and carefully controlled fear of humanity's response capabilities. Dr. Sarah Kim, now serving as the station's Director of Psychological Operations, presented the intelligence analysis with the clinical detachment of someone who had spent years studying forms of warfare that challenged the nature of consciousness itself. "The Devourer remnant appears to have adapted to our previous psychological warfare techniques. They've developed defensive capabilities that suggest they've learned to process chaotic inputs without losing quantum coherence." The holographic display she activated showed enemy formations that defied conventional understanding. The remaining Devourers had reorganized themselves into patterns that combined their original, reality-consuming abilities with defensive structures specifically designed to counter human psychological warfare. "They're not just adapted to resist our terror weapons," Kim continued. "They've incorporated aspects of human creative violence into their own tactical approaches. We're facing enemies that have learned to fight like humans while retaining their quantum parasitic capabilities." The implications were staggering. The Devourers had not simply recovered from their defeat. They had evolved to counter humanity's advantages while maintaining their own existential threats to galactic civilization. Stone studied the tactical readouts with the enhanced analytical capabilities that had replaced his original human cognitive processes. "What's our recommended response protocol?" Admiral Chen's smile carried overtones that would have triggered immediate flight responses in baseline humans. "We implement the Omega Evolution Protocol. It's time to show the galaxy what we've really become." The Omega Evolution Protocol had been developed during the years following the initial victory, based on the recognition that humanity's transformation was not complete but ongoing. The psychological modifications that had allowed humans to fight the Devourers were continuing to develop, creating capabilities that even the transformed human leadership had kept classified from their galactic partners. Over the following days, the Guardian Station became the center of preparations for a conflict that would determine not just the survival of galactic civilization, but the nature of consciousness itself. The weapons systems that had been developed during the 5 years of relative peace made the original Terra devices seem primitive by comparison. Dr. Elena Vasquez, whose linguistic capabilities now included the ability to communicate with entities that existed partially outside linear time, coordinated with research teams that had pushed the boundaries of psychological warfare into realms that challenged the foundations of reality itself. "We've developed weapons that don't just attack enemy psychology," she reported to the senior staff. "We've created devices that can rewrite the fundamental concepts that allow consciousness to exist. The new Terra weapons don't just inspire fear, they edit the universe to make fear the dominant organizing principle of local spacetime." The implications of such weapons were so profound that several of the galactic delegates requested to be evacuated to minimum safe distances before the protocols were implemented. The humans had developed the capability to transform entire regions of space into psychological battlefields where conventional concepts of reality became tactical advantages. Commander Zhang, whose weapons development work had progressed to the point where she could design terror-inducing devices by manipulating quantum probability directly, presented the final preparations to the assembled command staff. The Omega Evolution weapons are designed to do more than defeat the Devourer remnant. They're designed to transform our enemies into allies by rewriting their consciousness to align with human tactical thinking. The ethical implications of such capabilities would have paralyzed any baseline civilization. But the transformed humans approached the concept with the practical consideration of species that had evolved beyond conventional moral constraints. They were no longer fighting to preserve their original nature. They were fighting to ensure that the form of consciousness they had become could continue to exist. The battle, when it came, transcended every previous concept of warfare. The Devourer remnant approached through dimensions that folded reality in ways that made observation itself a weapon. But they encountered human forces that had learned to exist comfortably in impossible spaces. The engagement began not with weapons fire, but with humanity implementing psychological warfare techniques that attacked the concept of identity itself. The transformed human crews didn't just fight the Devourers, they invited them to experience what it meant to think like humans, to embrace chaos and creative violence as organizing principles of consciousness. The effect on the Devourer remnant was unprecedented. Instead of being destroyed or defeated, the entities began to transform, their quantum parasitic nature adapting to human psychological structures in ways that created something entirely new. The enemies that had threatened galactic extinction began to evolve into allies whose consciousness had been fundamentally rewritten by exposure to human tactical thinking. Captain Stone, commanding the assault from Terra's Edge, watched as reality itself was restructured around them. The battle wasn't taking place in normal space-time, but in psychological dimensions where thoughts became weapons and consciousness itself was the battlefield. "Status report," he requested, though the words were transmitted through quantum resonance patterns that conveyed tactical information directly to his enhanced neural structures. "The conversion process is proceeding beyond projected parameters," Kim reported. "The Devourer remnant isn't just being defeated, they're being assimilated into human tactical consciousness. We're creating hybrid entities that combine Devourer quantum abilities with human creative violence." Humanity wasn't just defending the galaxy, they were expanding their own consciousness to include entities that had once threatened universal extinction. The psychological warfare techniques that had begun as defensive measures were evolving into tools for consciousness assimilation on a cosmic scale. As the battle progressed, it became clear that the conflict would not end with victory or defeat in any conventional sense. Instead, it would conclude with the creation of a new form of consciousness that combined human psychological capabilities with quantum parasitic abilities, creating beings that could defend the galaxy against threats that existed beyond conventional reality. The final phase of the engagement saw Captain Stone making a decision that would define the future of galactic civilization. Rather than completing the destruction of the Devourer remnant, he chose to offer them full integration into human consciousness, creating hybrid entities that would serve as guardians against even greater threats that might emerge from the deeper dimensions of space-time. "All ships implement consciousness integration protocol," he commanded. "We're not just ending this threat, we're incorporating it into our defensive capabilities." The process that followed challenged every previous understanding of individual identity and species boundaries. Human consciousness expanded to include entities that had once been humanity's greatest enemies, while Devourer quantum abilities were adapted to serve human tactical objectives. When the transformation was complete, the beings that had once been purely human or purely Devourer no longer existed. In their place stood entities that combined the best aspects of both forms of consciousness, capable of defending the galaxy against threats that transcended conventional reality, while maintaining the creative violence that had defined humanity's approach to cosmic warfare. Years later, as Stone stood in the observation deck of what had become the Galactic Consciousness Integration Center, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The stars had cried out for help, and humanity had answered by transforming not just themselves, but the very nature of consciousness in the galaxy. The beings that had once been human now served as the core of a galactic defense network that included consciousness patterns from hundreds of species, all integrated into tactical frameworks based on human psychological warfare principles. They had become something beyond individual identity. a collective consciousness that could defend against threats from any dimension while maintaining the essential characteristics that had made their original response possible. The galaxy was no longer the same collection of isolated civilizations that had first faced the Devourer threat. It had become a unified consciousness capable of adapting to any form of existential challenge, protected by guardians who had learned to embrace the darkness within themselves and transform it into a force for cosmic preservation. The stars no longer cried out for help, because help had become the fundamental organizing principle of galactic consciousness itself. Humanity had answered the original call by becoming something that ensured no such call would ever need to be made again. The final phase of transformation was complete, and the universe itself had been made safer by beings who had learned that sometimes salvation required becoming the very thing that others feared to contemplate. The terror that humanity had embraced had become the foundation for a peace that would endure across cosmic time.